All right, welcome everyone. We're excited to see you all joining today's UNDC event. Today, we're not continuing the Digital Spotlight series or host an expo. We're taking this entire hour to dive deep into the topic of digital public infrastructure. And I will introduce you to our exciting agenda in a bit. But before we kick things off, as always, a quick reminder of the context of this community. We are part of the UN 2.0 initiative, and as digital, which is one of the the 6 key priorities, this community is all about exploring digital programming across the UN and connecting with digital practitioners. There are knowledge communities for each of the UN 2.0 areas, and so we encourage you to go ahead and check them out too. We will put the link to those in the chat. And you will be able to engage a lot more with each of these priority areas in the UN 2.0 week. So save the date and join us in June 9th to 13th. And then a very brief community update. If you've been part of the UNDC for a while, then you have both seen and read a lot of my colleague Johanna and I. But the team is actually growing, and I am very excited to welcome in this event the new community lead of the UN Digital community, Natalie McGee. She's a very experienced community manager, and she's built innovation and digital networks across WFP and UNDP. So now we're extremely lucky to welcome her to UN 2.0. And Natalie, I'm just handing over to you for an introduction from your end.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's such a pleasure to be joining, and I'm really looking forward to collaborating with this vibrant community and seeing all the incredible things we'll achieve and share together. So thanks very much, Julia, and back over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. And welcome. Also welcome again to all of you. To kick off today's session, I want to introduce you to the 3 fantastic speakers. We are joined by Benjamin Bertelsen, who is leading on all DPI projects in UNDP. And I will hand over to him in a second for an overview of what DPI is, what it isn't, and why it is a transformative approach for country digital transformation. Ben will then be joined by his colleague Francesco Stabilito. He is managing the DPI Safeguards Initiative for the UN Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies, and he will help us understand the guiding principles that are shaping the UN's vision for DPI. And then lastly, we are very excited to be joined by Rose Mozero. She is a data protection and cybersecurity advisor to the East African community and part of the UN DPI Safeguards Working Group. And she will be able to give us insights on everything that we will have learned by then, but from a practitioner's perspective. And with that, I'm handing over to Ben. Thank you for joining and welcome.
Thank you so much, Julia, and hello everyone who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm really excited to be talking about digital public infrastructure and also excited to be introducing and handing over eventually to my colleagues Francesco and Rose as well. Let me see if I can share screen here while I'm paddling a little bit. Do you see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll try and set the scene here in the next 20 minutes or so to unpack what is it we mean by digital public infrastructure, what's actually new under the sun here, and how should you think about it if you're a policymaker or if you're a system integrator or a vendor, or if you're just someone who's interested in public sector digitization and the future of digital and digital for good. This is a term, a concept, and an approach which we in the United Nations Development Program have been leading on, has been driving a lot of advocacy around and a lot of convening around for the past couple of years. I myself have had the pleasure of leading the team here together with my boss and working together with good colleagues and partners from all around the globe, supporting countries driving this journey forward. It's also something that we've seen been taken up by larger countries and pushing, and it's also something we've seen in the Global Digital Compact, which is, if you're in the international organizations world, if you're in developed world, you know it's a rather big deal in terms of when these concepts gets picked up there. At a very broad level, zooming out a little bit, we think we're looking at a new approach and new ways for government in which to be thinking about national digital transformation. So ignore the timelines here a little bit, because they'll depend a little bit on where you are as a country. But broadly for everyone, in the beginning, it was very much about taking from paper-based over to ones and zeros, just digitizing, really. And then eventually citizens and people, they got computers and they got access to internet, and government focused around creating portals and creating abilities for people to find information through their computers. And eventually people got feature phones, smartphones, and it became more around digital and user experience and digital journeys and owning solutions end to end. And now we're looking at this new phase of DPI, we believe. And I should say AI probably too, but we'll focus on the DPI part for this section. The reason why we're looking at a new approach, and why some countries are having quite a lot of success with this approach, is that despite all the progress that we've done, and despite that many countries have come really far and channeled a lot of economic growth, a lot of inclusion through digital, we've also seen some challenges with the way that digital has been done in government for many years. In particular, a rather high failure rate and high cost of doing GovTech, of doing government digital solutions for people. In particular, and if we're being honest, there are a lot of projects in government working with digital transformation that do not fully meet expectations. They're often delayed and they're often over budget. And two, if we look at the spend, the amount of money we're spending in the world of government sector ICT, then we see it's a very unequal spend. It's about 683 billion on government IT annually, but 90% of that is in North America, Western Europe, and what we could deem as mature Asia and China. Whereas a very tiny slice of it is for the rest, is for the low and middle income countries and least developed countries. Now, if we wanted to use the same amount, in other words, if we wanted to do business as usual, if the low middle income countries was to take the same approach as developed countries have done, then we're looking at a spend which we just don't have the funds for. Like, there's not this much money to spend on better digital public services. So we have to do it a different way. We have to find new ways in which we can deliver these services faster and cheaper through digital means where it makes sense. So the question DPI poses is, what if digital transformation in government was like how we developed and governed physical infrastructure? So think for a moment about the physical infrastructure around us. It's something we invest in because we believe it'll generate economic opportunity through shared investment. It's for public benefit. The roads we drive on, the water, the electricity, etc. It has some public shared benefit to itself. And because we're doing it in part for the public, and because we do make an investment from government side, we also believe there should be some public governance, transparency, oversight of this. Because these are big, expensive projects, we standardize it for easy use. We make sure that the 220 voltage that might come out of your plug, it's the same that comes out of my plug. It's a certain equality. The water is usually the same, the road we drive on are the same. And we build it with a sense of interoperability. So it doesn't matter whether it's a washing machine or a TV or a hairdryer I put in my plug, it'll work for all of it. The electricity to come out will work with all our appliances because we've ensured a certain standardization and interoperability to it. Also makes it a lot easier to build once we have these things in place. And so this use, it goes across. Doesn't matter which part of government is using the shared physical infrastructure, doesn't matter which part of business or civil society, it works for all. But this is not quite how we've developed digital within the public sector. Typically, if you put yourself in the shoes of a chief technical officer of a public agency, here it's public health I've taken as an example, or a director of ICT, they'll need to supply some services to people, mandated by law or by the government to issue some services. For instance, the ability for people to schedule an appointment with their doctor online, or the ability to digitally submit a request for lower drug prices because they might be able to get assistance from that from the government. And so typically you'll say, okay, within our ministry, within our agencies, we need some systems in order to do that. We need some apps, we need some portals, we need to have that. And in order to power those, we need some data. So we need to go into our databases and we need to gather this data in order to service people. Now, this does not happen just within the public health authorities. It also happens within education, social services, tax, Ministry of Home Affairs, and I could go on and on. Now, this happens because of some institutional logics in which government works, that I, as a boss, as an ICT director, I want to be able to have accountability and control down within my silo or down within my vertical. And that's, by the way, also how I budget for various things in order to be able to service people. But what tends to happen is that it leads to a lot of duplication, because there are actually many systems which we use in one part of government, which they also use in other parts. Scheduling systems, digital payments, registries of people, knowing who they are, being able to authenticate them, being able to verify them, and so on and so forth. And so for people too, when they interact with all these systems, it's a bit of a messy UI experience, and it leads to a lot of duplicating information, duplicating data in many different parts of government. So what DPI says at its core is that there are certain building blocks, there are certain pieces of technology that we can reuse over and over in government. Now, I'm not saying it's the exact same like front-end systems that the user interacts with, because they always need to be tweaked to their particular context. But there's often some of the middleware, some of the just underlying the front end that can be reused again and again. And they're typically related to digital ID, how people, they authenticate, verify themselves, how maybe they sign electronically, legal documents electronically, or digital payments, or data exchange, the way in which information is shared within government. And so how can this look like? What can these digital building blocks be? Well, it could, for instance, be going back to our example of public health. Could we think about a shared way in which we design this e-portal across government? Could we think about a SMS notification systems that's shared? Could we think about ID verification checks that goes over again and again, or e-signatures? So you'll have in the UK government, for instance, and this is not uncommon. This is, I think, in many ways a first step towards a shared way of doing things, a common design system, uniform way in which government portals are made. As you can already see here, it becomes easier to contract with vendors, with system integrators, if you can just point them to our government portal needs to follow these design guidelines, need to follow these templates. A little bit more detail, it could also be mail system, SMS system for engaging with citizens. So government of Singapore, for instance, has a system like that. They've rolled out across government, same system. Or related to this example I gave with ID. This is from the Danish government. So the same building block here, the same login system, registry way in which people authenticate themselves and access websites. Or for electronic signatures, here from Estonia. Again, a system that's actually open for everyone to go look and expect further, an open source system here for signing, replacing the print, sign, scan, send process. Now, I should say, because this is a confusion that sometimes comes up with DPI, some people tend to mistake that DPI is also the servers and the compute and the fibers and the connectivity and electricity. These things are immensely important. They are a foundation for digital transformation. But usually when speaking about the digital public infrastructure approach to national digital transformation, we do not include this. For better or worse, it's typically not part of the conversation. But that's not to say it's not important. Now, I want to touch a little bit upon the data sharing part as well, and how we think about data sharing within DPI. Because all these components and elements, they need data in order to work. So let's go back into our Ministry of Health and let's consider this scenario. You could consider this case of people who are eligible for government-assisted lower drug prices. And the product manager or the project manager in this ministry might say, okay, well, in order to check whether people are actually eligible to get lower drug prices, we'd need to access some data over in the social authorities, maybe in the Ministry of Social Affairs, to check this. And typically you'll say, okay, then let's set up a memorandum of understanding. Let's get the legal teams together from our ministry and their ministry, and we figure out how we can share this data so we can use it for our new application, so we can give people lower drug prices. Now, so you'll sign up these memorandums of understanding, and they'll typically be quite detailed in the way they specify what can you do with the data, what data is being shared, technically in what data format is it coming over, how frequently is it updated, used, when should we delete it, how long can we keep it, if third parties come and need the data, what data can we share with them, and how is our relation to sharing that data with them, let's say an insurance company, for instance, who are the authorized users, how is the data stored, etc., etc. Now, what the DPI approach would say is try and define what will the data exchange look like for your country. Is it a pooling infrastructure? Is it a direct architecture? Is it decentralized? And where can we standardize first in terms of our high-value use cases? So standardization, both ensuring semantically, we mean the same thing when we talk about the terminology for different things. The format in which technically the data is structured, schemas, etc., how it's encoded, ethical and legal compliance, fairness, non-bias around this data. So social eligibility, for instance, might take many different forms. And then say, well, can we take our MOUs and can we transform these various pieces of it into blocks of code instead? And this becomes our data interoperability framework. And then we built this out. And so what happens for countries that have done this is that the time it takes and the cost it takes to make these agreements drastically fall. It becomes a lot easier all of a sudden now to share data. And you've standardized the way data is shared in a much more standardized way. So it's a lot easier to get an overview. You might have heightened the standard of data protection at the same time. Because typically in the old system, if you go in to a ministry and agency and you ask them, how many of these memorandum of understanding do you have? And typically it'll be hard to get a response because there's so many at this point. Whereas in the electronic format, you get a better overview. You can more easily monitor, evaluate, have oversight on this. So this is typically how we think about data sharing in the DPI world. It's through data exchanges, it's through data interoperability frameworks, and it's through different architectures for scaling this across government. Now, I've talked a lot about government here, and I've talked a lot about internal government ICT, but really many of these, much of this middleware that I've discussed, it's actually also true for private sector. Banks, insurance, telcos, delivery services, they also need to authenticate and verify their users. At times, they also may need, with consent from people, they may need data on people that sits with the government. So crucial to the DPI approach is saying, well, our government digital transformation should also ignite innovation in the private sector. It should also enable private sector to develop new use cases to service people in a better way. And so we can think back to this idea of shared building blocks. Could the identity authentication and verification check also be built in such a way that private sector can tap into those systems too? Or could we allow this data sharing to happen for private sector too? And so the example I gave before with the login screen and that building block, same example here, but now you see it's two banks that are using the same digital component, using the same authentication for letting people in to do online banking. So how do we scale this? How do we think about getting this system, these building blocks out in scale? Where have countries done it successfully? But we need to put these things together, and we need to make sure these building blocks, they are accessible to developers in the private sector. So we need to have some degree of accessibility, typically to technical docs. So technical documentation where developers and system integrators, they can go and have a look at some of the code and see, okay, how do we work with this? How do we integrate it into our code? They can go and ask someone in government, typically in a digitization agency, okay, we're integrating so-and-so, can we get on your green list? This is our company, so we can get access to your API so we can start doing this. Now, one country that did this really successfully was India. As I mentioned at the beginning, a few countries have taken this approach and have been quite successful. Ukraine, Estonia, Brazil, Singapore, Mauritius. But I want to highlight the Indian example here just to take one. So after India pushed their identity system, Aadhaar, out and had a high registration rate, they connected the system with social grants and social payments together. And what they managed to do was they quite quickly managed to root out those people who were trying to double dip within social services, the ghost beneficiaries in all of this, and save in that way a lot of money in reduced fraud and leakages. But interesting too, because the ID system was quite trusted, they also managed to use the ID system and use the online authentication, verification, electronic signatures for people to remotely from their home with their smartphone open bank accounts. So not having to make the entire travel into the nearest bank branch. And so what that meant was that India in 2008 had about a 20% bank penetration, and then in just 9 years shot up to an 80% bank penetration, something which would normally have taken countries 47 years to do. Now, DPI played a huge role in that. There were also a couple of other programs in India that ushered this change in, but surely ID and the digital ID played a big role. Now, I'm saying all of this as if it just happens, but it happens under good governance and good data protection and good oversight and institutions within government that ensure this too. So DPI does not replace any of this. Okay, so let me just say 2 minutes a little bit about where we see countries struggling in our work at UNDP and how we're prioritizing some of our support. Quick advertisement, I'll make it quick. The technology for doing this is out there. Some of it is out there as digital public goods or open source components for people to go play with right now. Many of the countries that are leading on this, many of the teams are more than willing to jump on calls with system vendors or governments to share their knowledge and what they know in their systems. What's tricky, we find, is the mind shift change, in particular among senior leaders within government, moving from the siloed way into the shared horizontal components that need it. Because it raises a lot of new questions. And these are fundamentally governance questions. It's questions about accountability, mandates, money, responsibilities, etc. And all of these needs to be solved. And yeah, there's also a challenge related to the power that comes in the hands of some governments, which again goes back to the point of safeguards. Because as Uncle Peter, he said there comes a lot of responsibility with great power. And getting everyone into one database of people's biometrics and ID, it does provide a lot of power to government. Having the ability to lower the barrier for data sharing, it does give a lot of power. So there needs to be checks on this. And finally, we do see a real challenge as well in the varied lack of digital capacity, both in government, but also in local digital ecosystems that tend to vary a bit. So we had a lot of work to do in order to strengthen the capacity in countries to take on this work. Now, the reason of the lack of the digital capacity has many different reasons, and I list some of them here on the left side of the slide, but it is a definite challenge. It's something that governments, they keep raising in low and middle income countries. And quite frankly, also in developed countries, this is a challenge because IT expertise is expensive. So to summarize, we're looking at a new approach of advancing and accelerating inclusive national digital transformation and spurring further innovation, both in public and private sector. We believe the minimal, interoperable, open building blocks approach using good, both private sector software solutions, but sometimes also digital public goods, and open source is a good way to go. From UN side, we're advocating for doing this in a safe, inclusive, trusted manner. And we have a UN-wide initiative called the DPI Safeguards Initiative, which UNDP and the Office of Technology is leading, which Francisco he'll be talking more about now. Thank you very much for the attention, and over to you, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Ben, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks again, Ben, also for making my life easier now on discussing the DPI safeguard. Thank you for the overview about the DPI approach. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, thank you. So now in the next 10 minutes, I will walk you to give an overview about the DPI safeguard framework. It is designed to be a common starting point for considering risks when implementing DPIs and make sure that those risks are addressed and mitigated in the all stages of the life cycle. And the goal is to translate principles into really actionable recommendation to make sure that all the different stakeholders in the society can have a role to play for safeguarding. And in the following section, we are going to see the different components of the framework and how they all come together to safeguard DPI implementations. So Ben already highlighted the great opportunity that DPI really have for the society and the impact they can have across the different sectors. And really safeguard can play a crucial role to make sure that these opportunities are unlocked and untapped. For example, we can see here some SDG goal, and for example, in education and digital education, if digital systems are not designed with safeguard in mind, with, for example, gender sensitivity, the proportion of youth with ICT skill may not be really high. Or if we think of digital payments, if the penetration of the population is not really high, again, the digital divide will just cause increasing inequalities. So that's why really safeguard are central to all the implementation. And DPI safeguard are really about making progress to the SDG as much as they are about maximizing also trust in digital public infrastructure. Because as we see adoption of DPI really at scale, our core belief is that these emerging technologies can accelerate, as I said, economic growth. They can support transition to sustainable economy and also grow accessibility and public trust. So I want to give an overview about how the DPI safeguard initiative and then the framework came to life. I would say the starting point was 2021 when the Secretary General in his policy brief, the Common Agenda, called for a shared principle for open, free, and secure digital future for all. Then the initiative was really started in 2023, joined by the UNDP and our office that at the time was the Office of the Tech Envoy, and now is the Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies. While doing the General Assembly of 2023, we launched this initiative with the goal to build a framework that can be actionable and really usable for all the different stakeholders to implement safeguard in their DPI lifecycle and DPI project. Then the major milestone so far of the initiative was in September 2024. So 1 year after the launch of the initiative, we were able to release the first version of the framework. That, as I said, the first version, because the idea is to have really a body of knowledge that is dynamic and will continue to evolve, because as we know, the technology is moving fast and we want to make sure that safeguards are always relevant and applicable in all the different scenarios. So we are going to work also to improve it and iterate on that moving forward. So regarding the initiative itself, it really had a multi-stakeholder approach since the beginning, because in order to deliver a universal framework, it's important that different perspectives are included. So the number you see on the screen refer to 2024. So you can see the different channels we had to create the safeguard framework. First of all, we had the working groups. Last year, we had 44 experts from different backgrounds and different regions joining us, providing different perspectives from CSO to private sector, international organization, etc., to make sure really that the framework would be comprehensive. We have another multi-stakeholder mechanism, that is the International Organization Consultative Group. This is another group where we share our progress and we get inputs in order to make sure that what we're building also is applicable in different contexts and for different organizations. Then, of course, the framework must be tested in a local context to make sure that what we are building is actually applicable in different scenarios. So we are working with country engagement, and this was last year. This year, we are having even a higher number of countries that also our colleagues at UNDP are engaging with to test and then iterate the framework also for its evolutions. Also, we received more than 100 contributions to different convenings really in different regions of the world. And this really, all those things together, all these different elements helped us to shape a framework that is really comprehensive and universal as much as possible. So all those different mechanisms made possible in September, as I said, to release the framework. And we have also a dedicated guide to the framework that was released during the General Assembly last year. So now we are really focusing on actually actionize the framework. So make sure that countries, international organizations really picks this up and start using it and implementing. So we can also collect feedback to improve it, as I said earlier. So I want to walk you through now the different elements of the framework. We will see if there are risks, principles, life cycle stages, and responsible authorities. And those are the different components that really make the framework. We will start with risks. As Ben already highlighted, there are a lot of opportunities for DPI to really unlock development. At the same time, there might be the rising of risks that is important that are addressed. So when we started the initiative last year, we identified a number of different risks, and we clustered them together in what you can see here on the screen. So we have risk to safety, risk to inclusion, that we somehow define as risk to individuals. And then we have also structural vulnerability, which are more risk to society. So if we want to go a bit more into detail, risk to safety, they arise when personal data and digital system are susceptible to unauthorized access, and this can create a threat to personal data and safety. Then we have also risk to inclusions. Those risks undermine the inclusivity of the digital public infrastructure. And as we saw, DPI are meant to be used as society-wide. So it's really important that they are inclusive and that all different members of different communities can access those systems. And then we have structural vulnerability. Those exist more on a systematic level, and they include digital distrust or weak rule of law or weak institutions. So those were, let's say, our guiding risks, or someone that we always had in mind when developing the framework, to make sure that the recommendation that we were developing were addressing all the different risks. And in order to create a common understanding also of why safeguards are important, one of the central components are the principles. So the principles are basically a fundamental proposition, and they serve also as a strategic foundation to build a DPI that really serves all. And the idea of the principle is also to build a vocabulary that can foster a shared understanding of concept and enable an easier collaboration also in countries when DPI safeguards are needed. So we clustered principles in two different main groups. One are the foundational principles, and then we have the operational principle. So foundational principles, as you can read, you can see on the slide, that are really different, and they're really grounded in international rights frameworks to make sure that, for example, there is no harm caused by DPI implementation, or do not exclude, could be another example, where we want to make sure, for example, we do not exclude, so principle number 3, that all individuals should have access to the service, regardless of DPI access, or there should be also alternate measures. So the safeguard framework also looks at access to service from a digital perspective, but not only, to make sure that inclusivity is always present. Then we have also operational principles that are more relevant at operational level, and they're a bit more dynamic and depend across different contexts. So here we can see in the list of the different operational principles. And for example, we can see the one foster community engagement, or ensure remedy redress mechanism, because we want to make sure that when digital public infrastructure are deployed, different people have access to a mechanism where they can share any complaint on any issue they had, to make sure also to build trust, because as I said at the beginning, one of the goals of the safeguard framework is also to foster a public trust into digital public infrastructure. And those are the guiding elements that are supporting this objective. The next really important element of the framework are the ecosystem, because non-single ecosystem stakeholder can implement a DPI safeguard framework. So what we did, we identified different personas that then were clustered together in different responsible authorities to make the framework a bit more accessible and not too much granular. And the concept here that you can see is that, as I said, different responsible authorities have different responsibilities on implementing the safeguard frameworks, whereby not a single element of this ecosystem can make sure that all the different aspects of the framework are respected. So the different responsible authority are donors, the funders of DPI project. They play a really important role on defining how safeguards should be implemented in the project. Technology provider, of course, from a technical perspective, how the technology system and DPI are designed and implemented also are really important, that they play an active role on shaping how user will experience DPI. Then we have governments in the different aspects, from policymaker to technical project manager, regulators, and advocates. Now, we know that different countries have different realities. So what we build is something really dynamic that can be adjusted on different contexts, making sure that it's always relevant as much as possible. Another component really relevant of the framework is the different life cycle stages, because we understand that DPI is not really a linear process. There might be cases where there are already an existing system that are transitioning to a DPI approach. There might be a greenfield, even if there are even less and less cases today in the world of greenfield in the technology sector. But we understand in general it's not linear. And for this purpose, it's good to have different recommendations in different moments of the life cycle to make sure that safeguards can be implemented at any stage, regardless if you're already something in place or if you're starting from scratch. So the different life cycle stages that the framework addresses are from the beginning, so conception and scoping. Then it moves all the way to strategy and design, development, deployment, and maintenance. As you can see from this visualization, that we have arrows going in both directions. This really wants to emphasize the not linear process of DPI. And so it's really important that safeguards are applied at any stage, regardless if you're moving to one stage to the other in a linear way or not. So what we discussed in the previous slides is really what makes up the framework. So the framework is really, as I said, a living body of knowledge. The first version was released in September 2024. We are aiming to release a new version by the second half of this year in 2025 that will integrate feedback we received so far. It's also agnostic in terms of approach and definition, and is designed really to evolve and adapt in different societal contexts. Because we understand that especially digital systems are really dynamic and context specific. So to recap, we have the risks that are applied to the question why we need safeguard, or for what we need safeguard, and the principle that are the guiding component. Then we have the life cycle that represent a bit more when the safeguard implementation are needed, who should do it are the responsible authorities, and then the how is provided by the process and practice recommendation. When we built the first version of the framework, we created approximately 300 recommendations. So the body of knowledge is quite comprehensive, but we know it's not exhaustive. We know there are different aspects to be addressed, and that's why we are iterating this process to really move forward and make sure that the framework is still relevant. The last slide I want to share is about how to access the framework. So as I said, the concept to have a public open asset that can be accessible from different stakeholders. At the moment, it is accessible on the website. You can scan the QR code here or go to the website of the DPI Safeguard Framework. And the idea is really to allow all the different personas and different stakeholders to customize the use cases by filtering the different responsible authority, life cycle stage, which principles the user is interested in, or the risks, and just access the knowledge in a really tailored way. Also, this will undergo a major update this year. So I would say we really welcome any feedback to improve from the content itself, but also from the user interface. And more news will be shared also in the coming weeks. Now, I want to share really quickly what we're going to do this year. As I said, the DPI Safeguard Framework is really a living body of knowledge. It's going to evolve during the year. So this year we are focusing on three main different tracks. We have a global track where we want to mainstream the safeguard at ecosystem level. So we want different organizations to embrace the safeguard framework, provide inputs for its evolution. At the same time, we want to test the framework in local context to make sure that what was delivered last year is applicable and relevant at local level. At the same time, gather feedback to then iterate the framework and improve it based on the real experience coming from the ground. And then also we want to create more knowledge products to be useful for our stakeholders. And this will be done also to the working group members that we also have in 2025. It's a smaller group of people, but they will support us on delivering specific knowledge products to the different stakeholders. And talking about working groups, today we are joined by one of the working group members of 2025. It's Rosa Vocero. And Rosa, I will leave it to you to a brief introduction of and also a practical experience about the framework and DPIs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Just from a practitioner, I think I'll move to the next slide. For those who don't know what the East Africa Community is, it's a regional bloc comprising of 8 countries. I'm currently working there as the data protection and cybersecurity expert, and I was previously a deputy commissioner at the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner in Kenya. And so aspects of safeguards when it comes to DPIs were something that I work closely with. When it comes to the importance of safeguards, I think this has been said repeatedly by the speakers before me. They're critical to protecting rights and ensuring trust and preventing harm. One of the things that I think, specifically in the African context, having that trust ecosystem is very important, even when it comes to the foundational building blocks like digital IDs, because many times we find that they are rejected in implementation stage. And so having those beforehand are very important, but they also ensure that that there is accountability that is upheld, especially where there's public-private ecosystems and there's a sharing or multi entities dealing with the DPI infrastructure, DPI specifically, and their systems. I'll go to the next one. One of the challenges that we have, and I think this is not something that is particularly unique to, I guess, to Africa, but the lack of foundational documents. And so in many cases, there are things like cybersecurity frameworks, there are data protection frameworks, but in many cases, a number of these documents don't even exist. And so there is no institutions, there are no safeguards, there's no regulatory frameworks to actually guide safeguards when it comes to DPIs. And so they're implemented without these foundational documents, which is a real challenge, because then there is a lack or, well, the deployment then moves forward without the safeguards, but also there is very much a resistance with citizens who ultimately would benefit from this. Limited institutional capacity, I think this was mentioned previously, where in some cases safeguards were not an issue that was thought of before. And so we're having institutions that are either recently established or will be developed by virtue of I guess, international best practice or a recommendation by donor organizations to have these institutions in place, but they don't actually have the training or the capacity to ensure that they're providing proper oversight or even the technical capacity to see through the work that is being done. One of the things as well that we struggle with, especially in the African context, is a lack of contextual standards. And so standards usually, assume or have, I guess, the global north in mind. And so in many cases, cultural context as well as the realities on the ground in terms of basic things like connectivity, ways to have offline use of DPI systems to enable persons who might not necessarily have connectivity or even lack the digital literacy to ensure that they're actually utilizing or benefiting from DPI systems is something that needs to be addressed. And this is a challenge that is faced. Ambiguity of roles, I think this is especially again when there's multi-actor systems. The first speaker, Benjamin, talks about the MOUs. Again, this is something that might exist when you're thinking through DPIs in the long term, but sometimes those MOUs don't even exist. And so issues of who owns the data, how it's safeguarded, how it moves, how it's shared in a responsible way are not actually there. And this poses a very big challenge, especially for oversight authorities. Weak monitoring and oversight mechanisms. Many times we're encouraged to have CSOs come in as a monitoring system, or even regulators to actually look through the systems. But again, I've mentioned sometimes there are no regulators or they don't have capacity to actually properly provide oversight. When it comes to CSOs, many times, especially again I'll talk about the Kenyan context, they would usually come in towards a tail end, which means that they're coming in when a suit is brought rather than actually actively being engaged in the first place. And so this causes a big challenge when it comes to the safeguards. Low public awareness is also an issue. So, and this is both on the citizen side where systems are rolled out. They have no comprehension of the systems. Perhaps there's no public participation that has actually been done, which then creates a lot of resistance again for systems that might be beneficial, but because of the public awareness that is low, the lack of communication, then the systems sometimes fail. And we've seen this for digital identity systems in Kenya, not once, but twice. Prioritizing of speedy rollout. Again, we've seen this. One of the things, and just in a contextual framework or contextual framing in Kenya, for example, the initial digital identity, there was a prioritization of speedy rollout. There was no data protection authority. And so it had to be stopped after collection of almost 21 million individuals' data, just so that the state can actually have data protection laws and have established systems. And so these are some of the challenges and some of the things that actually happen on a day-to-day when it comes to the rollout of DPI systems. We'll go to the next one. On the practitioners' insights, again, there's a context matters. So there is this perceived, I guess, one-size-fits-all approach, which has been seen again specifically when it comes to certain DPIs when they're, I guess, migrated or pushed towards a culturally different environment, which makes it really difficult because obviously local users will be different, communities will be different, institutions will be different. And so there is a need for us to customize, which is not always the case. And so when it comes to investments, you find that if they're not contextualized, then you're investing quite a large sum of money for this systems to fail. One of the issues with compliance, so having a staged compliance, and I think this is one of the challenges that we're having a maturity sort of approach where we're embedding accountability, but also ensuring that we're supporting continuous learning so that the systems can actually evolve, especially where we're coming from a place where we don't have structures or systems or oversight mechanisms, ensuring that we're building from scratch, but also evaluating as we go. And then inclusion as a safeguard, so designing with equity and accessibility, which sounds like a very simple thing, but is not always the case. Again, one of the challenges, as I've mentioned, is the issue of rollout without proper structures or prioritization of rollout without actually thinking through. So things such as privacy by design, taking into account impact assessments for human rights and things like this come as an afterthought. And so having these things in mind so that, again, one, you're not investing with the possibility of having suits brought and systems being stopped whilst they're still being developed, but also not having to start from scratch when it comes to aspects of going back to redesign so that you're having equity and accessibility and feedback, taking into account, of course, the cultural context as well as the realities on the ground. This again include issues of digital literacy, issues of connectivity or lack thereof, and just cultural nuances, because again, everyone and every country does have those varied cultural differences. I'll give you an example. In Kenya, a lot of the DPI systems actually, especially when it comes to payments, social security, they adopt something called M-Pesa, which is widely adopted. It's a mobile money payment, which is widely adopted in Kenya, but might not necessarily be such a big thing in the Western world or the global North. And so some of these things, when you take into account design and not actually contextualizing such frameworks and systems is actually important. I know that I don't have much time, so I'll stop there. Just to emphasize again that it's important, even as we look at DPI systems, to ensure that they're not necessarily being built for mature environments and mature level countries. So in countries that can actually invest a large sum of money, but they actually look at not only aspects of standards, maturity levels, legislative frameworks, governance frameworks that exist even in countries that might not necessarily have those foundational frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. Julia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rose. Thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Ben. We have a little bit more time to learn even more. Ben has already answered a lot of questions in the chat, and I will make sure, or in the Q&A, I'll make sure that all the links that are shared in there will be in the recap as well, so that we're not losing track of them. There are a few open questions left around DPI models and services. So I'm just gonna hand this over to whoever wants to answer. Just group a couple of questions together. There was a question on how DPI is distinct from models like infrastructure as a service or data as a service. And then in context specifically where governments lack IT capabilities, whether there is a viable case for UN-backed partnerships to help build and maintain DPI systems. And then a third one about regional implementation specifically, whether there is advice on how to approach capacity development and securing funding to implement DPI solutions. It's a lot, but I'm just going to open up to whoever feels compelled to answer.
I can maybe come in first on the role of UN, and I think the question was maintaining infrastructure system, technical infrastructure system, and building, and then I think some of the data questions are maybe better with Rose or with Francesco. But in terms of that question and more generally like ownership of these systems, we see countries have done quite a few different things, and also depends very much on the institutional context and the history. Sometimes when we work with countries, the response is, we don't have time to build the capacity internally in our ministry to own this system or to have a lot of sovereignty and ownership. We need either because the government needs it quick, or the donor requirement needs it quick, or the loan requirement needs it quick. We'll just ask an IT vendor or system integrator to build this and maintain this, and then they go with that. So sometimes there are these constraints where governments have a hard time, and then what tends to happen is that you're then more in a procurement contractual relationship with someone that owns some of your core systems. Others, they may have time to say, okay, we'll do a 50-50. So we'll hire people internally who will learn with the system integrator or the system vendor building these very important systems over the 1, 2, 3, 4 years it might take to build up. And then there's some capacity, some internal knowledge how to maintain and build and upgrade them over time. What we'll often see is, and I noticed there was a question around cost as well, and the budget case, the business case. Countries that want to do it themselves, and it's very few that say we want to do it fully, tends to be quite costly in the short term, in the beginning, hiring the right people, getting them in, but then the cost might lower over the long term because you know how to do it internally. Whereas if you work with an IT vendor or system integrator, they'll say, okay, for a little change request or an update or a security patch or something, depending on what's negotiated in the service level agreement, they can charge a lot for that. Whereas it's often cheaper than to just be able to do it yourself. So for those contracts, it might be cheaper in the beginning, but your overall lifetime cost of the systems might be higher. So it's a bit of like, it varies a lot in terms of how countries do it. In generally, our advice from UN and UNDP side is when procuring, when buy it, do it for value, but also think about the national digital sovereignty as you do it, and make sure you have sovereignty and ownership over these foundational digital systems, because they are countrywide and they are so core for what you do, and they're going to work together with functionally any other system you have in your government. So it's really worth thinking twice about how much control and ownership do we have, including can we ourselves go in and inspect, monitor, update the code? Do we have source code level access, where we would say that's a pretty important thing to have for good parts of what you're owning? You might not have access to all of it, because sometimes there are some very unique parts, like maybe a biometric engine or something, or a deduplication engine in the ID system. That's maybe okay not to have insight into as a government, but many other things you should have. That was a longer speech, but I hope that covered some of it at least.
Thank you so much. There were a few questions specifically on how to measure the impact of DPI, ensure the principles, survey and document DPIs in countries. So maybe for a final comment, I'll hand over to Francesco and Rose. Maybe you can add some final thoughts on this.
Yeah. Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for the questions. They're really thoughtful, and it also help us on our process for 2025. I replied already a bit on the chat, but how can we ensure the principles and also how to support practitioners in the country on implementing safeguards is something we're really focusing on for this year, where we are aiming to release specific toolkits for different stakeholders, so for CSO, or for government and technology providers. And at the same time, we are trying to answer the question, how can we measure safety and inclusion in DPI project, and how can we support the adoption or compliance with DPI safeguards? So it's really on the making. We hope to have something to start sharing for feedback in the first June, July, let's say this summer, to then improve it and release it during the second half of the year. But we're really focusing now on those questions, how we can make sure that those principles have some knowledge document that can support actually the adoption. Yeah. And Rose, if you want to add something.
Yep, I'll add, I think there was a question on how it works for regional integration. And I think that fits in perfectly with what I'm doing and if there's funding opportunities. So actually the work that I'm doing is meant to foster regional integration amongst the 8 EAC countries, all of them with varied, I guess, systems when it comes to technology and infrastructure generally. But one of the foundational things that we're trying to do is have a shared data protection framework and a shared cybersecurity framework as a very basic thing to actually build on when it comes to sharing of data, sharing of digital ID systems, just to enable, a common market that is beneficial for regional integration. And yes, there is funding for this. It's actually the program that I sit on is funded by the World Bank. And so there are lots of donors that are interested in actually ensuring that this sort of regional integration is there because, again, there's economic benefit, but also social benefit to citizens when there's, bigger markets available to them. As well as, I guess, ability to expand generally and to have a stronger, especially for African countries, a stronger negotiating framing when it comes to having conversations with, I guess, stronger economies. So that's one of the benefits of that. I don't think I have anything to add to what Francesco has said, so I'll just leave it there. There was a question in regards to, I guess, how aspects of I guess data protection actually work in. So again, when it comes to safeguards and data sharing specifically, I think that was a question. Having checks and balances, so sharing of data is important when it comes to DPI systems. and even specifically in the work that I'm doing, which is a regional integration, that's literally the backbone, but having structures and oversight to actually ensure that there is mechanisms for redress. There are strong institutions that actually provide oversight and provide guidance. And when I say guidance, it means sometimes also just being in the mud with the governments that are actually trying to implement this, even though there should be independent regulators, is very important to have. So the structures need to be present for there to actually have oversight and to enable safe sharing.
Thank you so much, Rose. Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Ben. This has been super insightful. I'm so glad that we managed to address a lot of the questions. So grateful that you could spend this hour with us, both all you three speakers and you participants. I am just gonna share our contact on the board on the slides here. Feel free to reach out if there's any, if you want to do any, if there's anything that you want us to relate to the speakers. For example, I saw that there was something like that in the chat. We will make sure to share this session on all materials with everyone that has attended, and it will be up on the UN digital library as well for anyone to recap, so you can share it on. Huge thanks again to our speakers, and looking forward to seeing all of you in our next session. And until then, have a great rest of the day.